Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The day my brother took everything from me started like any other humid Saturday in June, with the screen door creaking open behind him, his muddy boots trailing grass through the hallway, and that same cocky half-smile plastered across his face like he owned the whole damn world. Rick always walked like nothing could touch him, like mom's two jobs and my B-minus GPA were just background noise to his spotlight. He was 5 years older, a local legend back in high school, quarterback, prom king, all that cliched crap. But now he was 25, broke, and somehow still the favorite. I was the quiet one. Always had been. I did my homework, stocked shelves at the corner gas station after school, and saved every dime I could. College was supposed to be the escape hatch, the one shot I had to claw my way out of this collapsing little town where dreams went to die in bar stools and pawn shop windows. My grandfather, Pop, knew that. He wasn't a man of many words, but before he passed, he left behind $15,000 for me in a custodial account. For Eli's future, he wrote in shaky block letters. So he doesn't get stuck here. I found out it was gone the same way I found out everything in our house, by accident and by walking in at the wrong time. Mom was crying in the kitchen, standing with her back to me, clutching the bank statement like it had personally spit in her face. Rick was sitting at the table, shirtless, chewing on a matchstick like he was in a goddamn Western movie. What the hell do you mean it's gone? Mom's voice cracked in that way it did when she was trying not to scream, but didn't have the strength left to whisper. It's not a big deal, okay? Rick shrugged like he'd just borrowed a couple bucks from her purse and forgotten to mention it. I needed it. I'll pay it back. You emptied the account. That was Eli's college money. College? He snorted, finally looking at me for the first time. Come on, Ma, let's be real. Eli ain't going to college. Kid's smart, sure, but he's soft. He'd get eaten alive out there. Besides, and this is where he leaned back, balancing on the two rear legs of the chair like a punk in a cheap sitcom, he's too dumb for college anyway. He laughed. Like it was a joke. Like he hadn't just taken a knife and gutted the only plan I had for something better. My mom looked like she'd aged 10 years in that moment. She didn't argue. She just put down the paper and walked upstairs, quiet and slow, like every step was dragging her deeper into something she couldn't climb out of. I didn't say anything either. Not then. Not right away. I just stood there, arms at my sides, heart beating like it wanted out of my chest, staring at Rick like I was looking at something that had already died and didn't know it yet. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the chair he was sitting in through the damn window. I wanted to tell him I'd never forgive him, that he'd killed something inside me I didn't know I needed until it was gone. But instead, I smiled. Just a small one. Just enough to confuse him. Because in that moment, I realized something. Rick hadn't just stolen money. He'd stolen my future. He'd kicked me down a cliff and laughed on the way down. But the thing about people like Rick? They only understand damage when it happens out loud. They don't notice the cracks that form in silence, not until the whole structure's coming down around them. So I played dumb. I said, it's okay, and I meant it. Not because it was okay, hell no, but because I needed him to think it was. I needed him relaxed, confident, arrogant. I needed him to keep underestimating me. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hands behind my head, and I didn't cry. I didn't scream into a pillow. I didn't punch the wall like some stupid kid in a soap opera. I planned. I started thinking back to all the times Rick had looked down on me, all the ways he'd gotten away with things just because he was charming, loud, and good-looking. I thought about the people he owed money to, the exes he ghosted, the boss he cussed out, the lies he told to keep floating. I remembered the time he stole our dad's watch and sold it for drug money, blaming it on a burglar. I remembered how Mom covered for him even then. It wasn't the first time Rick had taken what didn't belong to him, but it was going to be the last. Over the next few weeks, I acted like everything was normal. I went to work. I took my books to the library. I made dinner sometimes when Mom looked too tired to stand. I even laughed at Rick's dumb jokes and let him borrow my car when he needed it. I let him believe I'd forgiven him. He had no idea. He thought the story was over. But I was only just getting started. And what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that I wasn't just going to take something back from him. I was going to take something he could never replace. Something he couldn't fix or repay. Not money. Not a thing. But a part of him. The one part he thought was untouchable. And he'd never even see it coming. I smiled at Rick like it was no big deal. But in that moment, I decided I was gonna take back something way more valuable than money. He just didn't know it yet. The thing about Rick was that he never really paid for anything, not just in terms of money but in consequences, in guilt, in regret. It all slid off him like water off a duck's back, like shame didn't stick to him the way it stuck to the rest of us. After stealing my college fund and tossing that insult in my face like a half-finished beer can, Rick didn't even bother to lay low or act sorry, not even for our mom's sake. Instead, he walked around the house like some king returned from battle, tossing dirty laundry on the floor and eating the last of the cereal straight from the box, burping loud enough to rattle the cupboard doors. Every morning, I'd find him on the couch with his feet on the coffee table, scrolling through his phone with that same damn smirk on his face, like the world owed him something and was late in paying. Meanwhile, I'd head off to the gas station, stacking boxes in the back until my knuckles split, coming home reeking of diesel and sweat, nodding politely when he asked me to grab him a beer from the fridge, and I always did. I always said sure, and no problem, and you got it, man, because I needed him to keep seeing me the same way he always had. Harmless, forgettable, not worth a second thought. In town, people still treated Rick like he was something special, like he was a guy who'd just hit a rough patch, even though his rough patch had lasted almost a decade and left a trail of burned bridges long enough to wrap around the county twice. They called him a character a little wild, still figuring it out, and all that coded language people use when they don't want to say someone's a complete disaster. At church, old ladies pinched his cheek and told him how proud his daddy would be. At the hardware store, men offered him leads on jobs they never intended to follow up on. And me? I was invisible. I was the background noise, the kid bagging groceries, the quiet one, the one who couldn't even hold on to his college money. Nobody asked me how I was doing. Nobody asked me what I wanted. They just assumed Rick was the story and I was the footnote. That's when I started paying attention, really paying attention. I started watching Rick like you'd watch a movie with subtitles, noticing all the little things I'd missed before, like how he always took phone calls in the driveway with the car running, or how he got real twitchy whenever certain names popped up on his screen. I learned his tells, the way he scratched his neck when he was lying, how he got defensive when he'd lost money again, the way he bragged just a little too much when he was trying to cover his fear. He thought he was slick, but Rick had more cracks than a dollar store mirror, and I was counting everyone. He had secrets. Most people do, sure. But Rick's secrets were sloppy, loud, and careless. He left them lying around like cigarette butts. There was a girl in town, younger than me even, who'd been seen slipping out of his truck late one night behind the bowling alley. There was the liquor store guy who muttered under his breath about Rick writing bad checks again. There was even talk at the VFW that Rick was back on pills, not Oxy, not anymore, but something new, cheaper, worse. And through it all, I just nodded. I smiled. I pretended I didn't hear the things I heard or see the things I saw. Because what Rick didn't understand, what he couldn't understand, was that I wasn't trying to catch him anymore. I was building something. A map. A web. A slow, creeping story that would eventually wrap itself around him so tight he wouldn't even realize it until he couldn't breathe. But the real match? The spark that turned all this quiet fury into a plan? It came one Sunday afternoon, the kind of lazy day where the heat presses on you like wet wool and the TV's stuck on reruns of shows that make your skin crawl with their canned laughter. Mom was at work, as usual, and I was folding laundry on the couch when Rick came downstairs wearing nothing but boxers and that same smug grin he always wore when he was about to say something cruel disguised as a joke. "You know," he said, tossing a dirty sock at my head and flopping down beside me, "I've been thinking. Maybe you should just forget about college altogether, huh?" I didn't say anything, just kept folding shirts, slow and steady, like his words didn't mean anything. "I mean, come on," he continued, grinning, "you're not really the college type. You're more like, I dunno, a lifer. You know, gas station guy. Maybe assistant manager if you really push yourself." He laughed. Loud, sharp, the kind of laugh that digs under your skin and nests there like a splinter. And that's when I looked at him and realized something that changed everything. Rick didn't think he'd hurt me. He thought he'd won. He believed that he'd broken something in me and that I'd just accepted it, like some mutt kicked too many times who learned not to bark. And that belief? That overconfidence? That was the crack I needed. Have you ever had someone betray you so badly and then laugh in your face like it was no big deal? What would you have done if you were me? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious. After that day, I started collecting stories. Not just about Rick, but about everyone connected to him. I talked to the girl from the bowling alley, real innocent-like, just chatting, asking if she wanted help with her math homework. I offered to mow the lawn for his old boss and ended up hearing all about how Rick had walked out mid-shift and taken $300 from the register. I learned who owed him favors and who hated his guts. I learned which bars he was banned from and which ones still let him drink on credit. And all the while, I stayed quiet. Because it's funny what you learn when you're invisible. People say things when they think no one's listening. And Rick? He said plenty. It started as nothing more than a couple of scribbles on a torn piece of receipt paper, just a few things I couldn't stop thinking about after one of Rick's bragging sessions over dinner, some offhand comment about a girl he was keeping warm on the side, and the spot behind the loose brick in the garage wall where he hid his cash. I remember sitting there, chewing on overcooked spaghetti, nodding along while Mom told us to be thankful for the roof over our heads, and thinking to myself, he's not even trying to hide anymore. That was when I realized the truth I hadn't quite dared to face yet. Rick didn't just think he'd won, he didn't think there was a game being played at all. And that ignorance, that blind, smirking arrogance, was going to be the very thing I'd use to unravel him. So that night, I opened an old spiral notebook that had once been meant for biology class and wrote 3 words across the first page in thick black ink, things Rick loves. It wasn't meant to be poetic or clever or even all that structured. It was just a starting point. But once I started writing, the pages filled up faster than I expected. Rick didn't love much in the way normal people did, not family, not responsibility, not loyalty, but he did love things. Control, attention, women, fast cash, pills, the illusion of power, even if he had to borrow it from people dumber or more desperate than he was. By the end of the week, I'd filled 5 pages with names, places, patterns, and observations. I made categories: weaknesses, secrets, liabilities, and my favorite, untouchables. These were the things Rick thought were safe from consequences, the parts of his life he kept closest to his chest, because he believed no one was smart or petty enough to use them against him. But I wasn't just someone. I was his brother, and no one was closer to the dirt than I was. I'd seen every skeleton in his closet. Hell, I'd helped bury some of them. He didn't know that I'd followed him once when he said he was meeting a buddy about work and ended up at a trailer parked behind the abandoned feed store on Route 9, where a guy named Tully sold him a small baggie and a few pills for later. He didn't know that I'd watched from the corner booth at Kelly's Diner while he leaned a little too close to a waitress named Melissa, whispering things in her ear while his main girl, Ashley, waited at home thinking he was watching the game with me. He didn't know that I'd been in the garage when he stashed that wad of cash, maybe $400, inside an empty Folgers can behind the loose panel, muttering to himself about keeping this from the bastards. And as much as he didn't know, I kept learning. I learned the name of the man Rick owed $2,000 to, a guy named Marco with a busted nose and a mechanic's shop that doubled as a money laundering front. I learned that Rick wasn't just using, he was dealing on the side. Small stuff, but enough that if word got out, the wrong kind of people would start asking dangerous questions. I learned that he'd lied about finishing his community service and was technically still on probation. I learned that he sometimes wrote fake invoices, using Mom's name for tax returns she never filed. And while I was learning all this, Rick wasn't paying attention to me at all. Why would he? To him, I was the harmless little brother folding laundry, driving to work in the beat-up Civic, and quietly refilling the gas tank when nobody else would. He didn't notice that I was never home Tuesday and Thursday evenings, too caught up in his own nonsense to realize I was taking night classes at the community college, using a grant I applied for without telling anyone. I took 2 courses, one in psychology and one in basic business finance. I figured, if I was going to dismantle my brother's world brick by brick, I should at least understand how the walls were built in the first place. I worked weekends at the gas station and picked up shifts bussing tables at DeSoto's Grill on Thursdays. I saved every dollar I could and pretended not to notice when Rick borrowed money from Mom's purse again. I kept my head down and my mouth shut because revenge doesn't come to those who scream, it comes to those who wait. One night, sitting at the kitchen table after everyone had gone to bed, I flipped back through my notebook and realized it had stopped looking like a list and started looking like a blueprint. Every piece of Rick's life was laid out in sections, cross-referenced and dated, with arrows pointing toward the pressure points, the spots that could collapse him from the inside if applied just right. His drug habit? Connected to Marco. His affair? Connected to Ashley's dad, a retired sheriff. The fake invoices? Connected to our mother's name, her job, her taxes. Each string was fragile alone, but together, they were a fuse just waiting for the right spark. And I didn't need to light it all at once. I just needed to wait until he leaned too hard on the wrong lie, until his weight cracked the structure I'd already hollowed out. He'd think it was bad luck, or bad timing, or the world finally turning on him. He'd never suspect it was me, the quiet brother, the soft-spoken kid who folded shirts and got called dumb over spaghetti. You don't need a knife to cut someone deep. Sometimes you just have to know exactly what to take, and when to take it. There's something beautiful about watching a man unravel slowly, not all at once in a blaze of sirens and headlines, but piece by piece, like rust eating through the frame of a car that still looks shiny from 10 feet away. Rick had built his whole life around appearances, the loud voice, the swagger, the forced charm, and like all good illusions, it only worked if no one looked too closely. But I'd been watching closely for months now, and beneath the surface, the cracks were spreading wider by the day. It started with a name I recognized from childhood but hadn't heard in years, Vanessa Rhodes, the daughter of my mom's oldest friend, Gail, the kind of woman who wore perfume to pick up groceries and still called me sweetheart whenever she saw me in town. Vanessa had married a local cop named Brad Whitman, a tall, square-jawed guy who coached Little League and always paid for coffee with exact change. She was, by all accounts, a good girl who'd grown into a quiet, pretty wife with no real scandal to her name, until I saw her climb into Rick's truck outside the liquor store at 9:30 on a Tuesday night. They didn't see me sitting in my car across the lot, flipping through a textbook while eating cold fries from a paper bag. They never looked. Rick leaned over and kissed her on the mouth like they had all the time in the world and no one to answer to. She looked scared. Not guilty scared. That was the first detail I filed away in my head. Rick didn't just seduce, he cornered. He didn't win people over, he made them believe they owed him something. I didn't confront her. That wasn't the point. The point was to know. To collect. I started hanging around the library on weekday evenings because Vanessa volunteered there sometimes, helping run the children's reading hour. I bumped into her once, twice, 3 times, always by coincidence, always with a smile. I told her I was taking night classes. I said I was working on a paper about small-town history. She opened up quickly. People like her always do when they feel invisible and someone finally asks them a question. She never said the words out loud, never admitted to the affair, but she gave enough away in nervous glances and unfinished sentences that I didn't need a confession. I already knew. I didn't need to catch them in bed, I already had the photograph in my mind. And as I pieced together the timeline, the hows and whens of it, I began to realize something far more useful than just another notch on Rick's list of failures. Vanessa wasn't just cheating on her husband. She was afraid of Rick. And that gave me a lever I hadn't expected. While I built trust with her, Rick began to fall apart in louder, messier ways. The gambling losses came back hard. I overheard him screaming into the phone one night, begging someone named Deke for more time, promising he'd get the cash by Friday. I didn't even flinch. I just turned the TV volume up 2 notches and waited for him to stomp out of the house, slamming the door like it owed him money too. A few days later, I left an anonymous tip with the State Gaming Commission, nothing too dramatic, just enough to get a pair of eyes on the underground poker ring Rick frequented every other weekend. It wasn't about getting him arrested. Not yet. It was about making him nervous, making him sweat. Then came the DUI. He got pulled over on a back road outside of town, just past the billboard for the retirement home that used to have my grandfather's face on it. Bloodshot eyes, open bottle in the cup holder, license plate expired by 8 months. But Rick, as always, talked his way out of the worst of it. The officer was someone he knew from high school, and after some fast talking and a firm handshake, Rick drove home with a warning and a shaky smile. But even as he bragged about it later that night, slurring his speech, spilling beer down his shirt, I could see it. The panic, the crack in his grin, the shadow of a man who'd started to suspect the world was no longer on his side. That's when I planted the next seed. A quiet little whisper dropped into the right ear at the right time. I knew Brad, Vanessa's husband, coached football at the middle school. I knew he had lunch every Thursday with Officer Darren Keller at the Blue Hen Cafe. I also knew that people who protect the town don't like being the last to know their homes are falling apart. So I left a folded note under Keller's windshield wiper and signed, untraceable, written in block letters, ask Brad where his wife was last Tuesday night. Simple. Clean. Just enough to push a question into the air. I never saw the fallout directly, but I didn't need to. Within a week, Vanessa quit her volunteer shift. Rick's truck had a fresh dent on the passenger side door. And my mom started mentioning, offhandedly, how something seems off with Rick lately, as if she'd only just now begun to notice what I'd known all along. And then came the drugs. Or rather, the discovery of them. It was a Friday night, a thunderstorm rolling in, and Rick came home soaked to the bone, pacing, muttering, twitching like a man who'd misplaced something more important than keys. He went into the garage and stayed there for over an hour, tearing through old boxes and cursing loud enough for the neighbors to hear. When he finally came inside, he looked pale, hollow-eyed, like someone had carved a piece out of him and not bothered to stitch it shut. 2 days later, he got pulled over again. This time, they found a small baggie under the driver's seat. Cocaine. Just enough to matter, not enough to send him away. Rick swore it wasn't his. Swore someone must have planted it. Swore the world was out to get him. Maybe it was. Maybe I was. But none of that mattered anymore. Because now the cracks had started. And I wasn't going to stop until the whole damn mirror shattered in his hands. When Rick got pulled over and they found the coke under his seat, he swore he didn't put it there. Maybe he didn't. But it didn't matter anymore. The cracks had started. The call came on a Tuesday morning, just after dawn, when the air still smelled like wet asphalt and stale cigarettes, and I was walking out the door to head to class, balancing a thermos of bad coffee in one hand and my notebook in the other. My mother answered it in the kitchen, and I stopped just inside the hallway when I heard her voice break in half mid-sentence. There was something about that silence between her sobs, the kind that fills a house before the shouting starts, that told me whatever had happened, it had finally tipped over into something real. Something we couldn't ignore anymore. She hung up and just stood there at the sink, holding onto it like her knees didn't quite trust the floor beneath them. I asked who it was, trying not to sound too curious, trying to keep my voice flat, calm, the way I always did when something in me twisted sideways. She didn't answer for a moment, then said, almost like a whisper that had aged 10 years overnight, "It's Gail. Vanessa's in the hospital. They said it was pills." I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe right away. The image of Vanessa flashed in my head, the way she looked the last time I saw her, arms folded across her chest like a shield, eyes darting around as if someone was watching her even when she knew they weren't. The guilt that crept through me wasn't sharp or dramatic like in the movies. It was slow, dull, a deep bruise that started in my ribs and worked its way out to my fingers. I hadn't told Brad directly. I hadn't written her name on the windshield note. I hadn't forced Rick to get involved with her or made her crawl into his truck at night. But still, I had lit the match, and no matter how long the fuse had been, the explosion was mine to answer for. By that afternoon, the whole town knew. Small towns eat scandal like it's their only source of nutrients, and this one was Rich, the sheriff's daughter, the cop's wife. The hometown grew up with drugs and debt, and a reputation for blowing through women like tires on a gravel road. The news spread fast, fueled by whispers, half-truths, and grocery store glances, until no one could pretend not to know anymore. Gail didn't come to church that Sunday. Brad took time off from the department. And Rick? Rick acted like the universe had personally betrayed him. He stormed into the house 2 days later, face flushed and wild-eyed, tossing his keys across the living room like they'd burned him. "They're trying to ruin me," he shouted, pacing back and forth like a man watching the walls close in. "Brad's got it up for me now. He wants me dead. I know it. I can feel it." Mom sat in the corner, not saying a word, just watching Rick with eyes that no longer saw her son, only the wreckage he dragged through the door every time he came home. I stood in the doorway, arms folded, silent, watching him unravel with every breath, and part of me wanted to feel satisfaction. Part of me wanted to say, "Good. Let it all burn." But another part, the one I hadn't listened to in months, felt cold, empty, afraid, because for the first time I saw it, this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This wasn't a clean story of justice or balance. People were getting hurt, not just Rick, but people on the edges, people who'd never mocked me or stolen from me or laughed in my face when I lost everything. Vanessa had been scared. Gail had loved her daughter. Brad, for all his stern silence, had built a life with someone he trusted, and now that trust was bleeding out on a hospital bed within 4 drip and a note that no one talked about but everyone knew existed. That night, I walked past my mother's bedroom and heard her crying. Not the kind of crying that wants to be heard, the quiet kind, the helpless kind, where the sound barely escapes the throat because the weight is too heavy. I stood outside her door, listening, hand on the frame, and I hated what I'd done. Not because Rick didn't deserve what was coming, he absolutely did, but because I'd let my mother suffer to get there. I had let the one person who had given up everything just to keep this house from collapsing believe that maybe she had failed somewhere too. I thought about stopping. I thought about taking the notebook and burning it in the fire pit behind the garage, about deleting the files on my computer and going back to just being the quiet one, the kid who once had college dreams and lost them to a brother's ego. Maybe I could still take my classes, still scrape together enough to build something for myself without dragging everyone else into the darkness with me. But then I remembered the look on Rick's face the night he said I was too dumb for college, the way his lip curled like a sneer, like my future was a punchline he got to deliver any time the room got too quiet. I remembered the months he spent walking around this house like he owned it, like he'd done nothing wrong, while I cleaned up his mess and folded his laundry and smiled like I didn't see the stain he'd left on everything we had. And I remembered something else too, a truth that settled in deep and refused to move. Rick wasn't going to stop until he had destroyed everything around him, either by accident or design. He was a man in freefall, dragging down anyone close enough to grab. If I walked away now, the damage wouldn't stop, it would just shift, just delay, just find another way to keep going. So I made a choice. I didn't burn the notebook. I sharpened the pencil and turned to a new page. That night, I asked myself if I should stop. And then I remembered Rick's face when he said I was too dumb for college. And I kept going. There's a strange kind of quiet that comes right before a man thinks he's finally outrun his past, like the moment before the ice cracks beneath his boots, when everything seems too still, too perfect, like the storm already passed and somehow forgot to wreck him on its way through. That was Rick, standing in our kitchen on a sunny spring morning, flashing a new smile I hadn't seen before, not the smug grin or the sneering laugh, but something else, something closer to relief, maybe even hope. He said her name was Danielle, said she was different, said she worked at the bank and had her shit together, and for a moment, even our mom looked like she might believe him. Danielle was all the things Rick never was: put together, well-liked, the kind of woman who spoke in full sentences and made eye contact when she talked to you. She came from a family with old roots in town, folks who donated to the community theater and had pictures of their grandkids in church bulletins. Rick cleaned up fast. He got a haircut, stopped drinking in the house, even started going to AA meetings once a week, though I suspected it had less to do with sobriety and more to do with appearances. He brought Danielle around every Sunday, and Mom practically floated between the stove and the table, feeding everyone like the last 2 years hadn't aged her 10. People said he was changing. The gossip shifted. No more whispers about pills or poker debts or the sheriff's daughter in a hospital bed. Suddenly, it was all about second chances, fresh starts, the kind of small-town amnesia people specialize in when it's more comfortable than confronting the truth. Rick proposed 6 months later at the town fair, in front of the Ferris wheel, with someone's cousin filming it on their phone, like it was something sacred. I stood in the crowd and clapped, smiling like a brother should, and no one noticed how tightly I clenched my fists in my coat pockets. Because I knew better. I knew Rick hadn't changed, not really. What he'd done was rebrand. He'd slapped a coat of white paint over the mold and called it a remodel. But underneath? Underneath, the rot was still spreading, still hungry, still waiting for its moment to break through again. And this time, I wasn't going to wait for him to wreck someone else. I was going to do it for him, carefully, quietly, and with enough elegance that even he wouldn't realize it until the damage was too deep to reverse. The plan started with a simple idea, a gift. Something a little unexpected, a little generous, something that made me look like I wanted the best for him. I told Rick I had a friend, a guy from my night classes, whose dad had just opened a new logistics company about an hour north. They were looking for someone local, someone who could manage deliveries, keep the warehouse running smooth. Good pay, benefits, company vehicle. It was everything Rick had ever bragged about wanting, and he jumped at it before I even finished the sentence. I set up the interview at a small office suite I rented under a fake business name, complete with a website, business cards, and a LinkedIn profile for the fictitious hiring manager, a man named James Elwood. I even used a photo of a real guy, someone I found on a stock photography site who looked just credible enough to be believable, but plain enough not to raise eyebrows. Rick shaved for the meeting, wore a suit he hadn't touched since his court date, and walked out the door like he was finally stepping into the life he always thought he deserved. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that the whole point of the interview wasn't to hire him. It was to see what surfaced when someone finally looked at Rick Bennett like a real employer would. I'd paid a background check service to run everything: criminal history, financials, known associations. I already knew what they'd find, but seeing it laid out in a clean PDF was a different thing entirely. The arrests. The drug paraphernalia. The unpaid debts still sitting in collections. The restraining order filed and later dropped by a girl he dated 3 years ago. There was even a report from a halfway house he'd briefly lived in after one of his gambling vendors, something he'd never even told Mom about. I sent that report anonymously to Danielle, not all of it, just the highlights. Just enough to raise a firestorm without burning the whole field. I included screenshots, dates, quotes from public records. I timed it for the Thursday before the rehearsal dinner, when all the invitations had already been sent and the deposits were long gone. I didn't add a note. I didn't need to. The night it hit, Rick didn't come home. Mom sat at the table in her robe, phone clutched in one hand, glasses pushed up into her hair, staring out the window like she could see the truth forming in the driveway. Danielle didn't call, didn't show up. Just vanished from the picture with the kind of precision that tells you she'd always had an escape plan tucked in her purse, just in case. By Saturday, the wedding was off. Rick tried to spin it. Said they'd decided to slow down, told Mom it was a mutual thing, but the way he wouldn't meet my eyes when he said it told me he already knew. Knew someone had pulled the curtain back. Knew someone had whispered into the wrong ear at the exact right moment. He didn't know who. Not yet. But the damage was done, and the pieces weren't coming back together. He never even made it to the altar. But his fiancée sure did with the screenshots I gave her. And the ring? Pawned. I made sure of that. It came to a head not with a bang, but with something far worse. A conversation that started soft and ended in a silence that screamed through the walls of the house louder than any fight we'd ever had. I'd gotten comfortable, maybe too comfortable, walking through the aftermath of Rick's unraveling like I was wearing gloves, never leaving fingerprints, always keeping just enough distance to stay clean in the eyes of the people who mattered. But I should have known better. I should have known the woman who raised both of us, who scraped and stitched and sacrificed her way through every hard year we'd dragged into this house, was never going to stay blind forever. She found the envelope one morning in the pocket of my jacket, tucked there like a loose scrap I'd meant to throw away, but hadn't. I didn't even know which version it was. I'd written so many notes by that point, drafts of plans and names and half-buried details in the margins of receipts and notebook paper, that I'd stopped keeping track. This one wasn't even the worst of them. It was just a list, I think, with arrows pointing from one lie to another, one weak point to the next. But it was enough. Enough to let her see past the version of me she thought she knew. I came home from class that afternoon and found her sitting at the kitchen table, not moving, not blinking, the paper laid out in front of her like a crime scene photo. She didn't say anything when I walked in, just pointed at the chair across from her and waited. And when I sat down, she looked me in the eye, or really looked, and I knew it was over. Whatever line I'd been walking, whatever invisible wall had separated me from Rick in her eyes, it wasn't there anymore. I had stepped over it, and now we were just two boys who had broken things. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked, voice quiet but full of steel. I didn't answer right away, because I knew there wasn't a version of the truth that would make her understand. Not in the way I needed her to, not in the way that wouldn't break her heart. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," I said finally, and even as I said it, I heard how pathetic it sounded. How dishonest. She laughed, once sharp and bitter. "That's what he used to say," she said. "Every single time. It wasn't supposed to go this far." I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, she stood up so fast the chair scraped across the tile, walked to the sink, and turned her back to me like she couldn't bear to look. Then she turned around and slapped me. Not hard enough to hurt, not in the way Rick used to swing when he was drunk and angry and cornered, but with something far heavier behind it. Disappointment. Disgust. A kind of grief that settles deep in the chest and refuses to move. "You're not better than him," she said. "You're just quieter about it." That was all. No lecture. No screaming. She left the room without another word, and for the first time in a long time, I felt small. Not in the way Rick had tried to make me feel with his jokes and jabs, but in the way that comes when you look at yourself in the mirror and realize you've become someone you swore you never would. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote a letter to Rick. Not an apology, I wasn't ready for that, and maybe I never would be, but an explanation, or at least an attempt at one. I didn't even know who I was writing it for. Him? Myself? Some version of us that never existed? I poured it out anyway. Page after page. I wrote about the money he stole. About how much I hated him for laughing at me. About the first time I decided to take something back, not the money, but control, power, even if it was just for a second. I wrote about the list. About Vanessa. About Danielle. About the trap with the job interview, and the way I'd watched him lose everything, not with pride, but with a coldness I hadn't known I was capable of. I told him I hadn't planned for it to get this far, that it was supposed to be a warning, a lesson, not a demolition. I wrote about Mom and how her tears felt heavier now that they came for both of us. And then I wrote about fear not of being caught, but of what I was becoming. I signed it without a name. I folded it, sealed it in an envelope, and stared at it for hours, holding it in my hands like a ticking clock. Then I walked outside, into the dark, into the cold, and I burned it in the fire pit behind the garage. Watched it curl and blacken and lift into the sky, letter by letter, lie by lie. Some things aren't meant to be forgiven, and some things aren't meant to be fixed. They're just meant to be finished. The years didn't pass quietly, but they passed nonetheless, slipping by one long season at a time like chapters in a book you never really meant to finish, but kept turning the pages anyway, because stopping would have meant facing the silence left behind. I finished school, real school this time, not the night classes and gas station hours that defined my teenage years, and walked across a stage wearing a cheap gown with a name they almost mispronounced, but didn't. My mother sat in the crowd and cried without shame, and in that moment, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, some part of what I'd done had been worth it. I got a job 2 states away, doing systems work for a company that barely noticed I existed, which suited me just fine. I didn't want the spotlight. I wanted stability. I wanted control. I wanted a life built on something stronger than spite and shame, even if I knew, deep down, that spite had been the scaffolding I used to climb out of the hole Rick had left me in. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment with cheap blinds and quiet neighbors, started drinking my coffee black, and stopped checking Facebook for updates about anyone back home. But the past has a funny way of keeping your number, even when you change addresses and erase the voicemail greeting. I saw him one afternoon in early October, years after the last time we spoke, when the leaves had started to turn and the sky held that tired kind of blue that meant winter was coming soon. I was visiting my mother for the weekend, helping fix a window in the shed and replace a few dead outlets in the kitchen. She didn't talk about Rick anymore, not in a bitter way, just in that resigned, hollow tone that meant she'd packed him into a part of her mind where nothing ever changed and nothing ever healed. She still set a second plate at holidays, just in case. He was sitting outside the diner when I walked past, hunched over a chipped styrofoam cup and a stale cigarette, looking smaller than I remembered, like someone had taken the edges off him and left nothing but the outline. His hair was thinner, his hands twitched when he reached for his lighter, and his eyes, when they met mine, didn't flash with recognition at first. But then something shifted behind them, like a memory waking up from a long sleep, and he stood, slowly, brushing crumbs off his jacket that looked about 2 sizes too big. "Eli," he said, and for a second, it was like being 16 again, like hearing that same voice in the hallway after he'd raided my drawer for cash, like all the weight of the past came rushing back in the space between syllables. I didn't answer. Just looked at him, still, calm, waiting. He took a step closer, his voice dropping, rough around the edges now, hoarse from too many years spent screaming at things that never listened. Did you do all this?" he asked, and there was something in his tone I hadn't heard from him since we were kids. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even desperation. It was doubt. Fear, maybe. The quiet kind. The kind that comes when you realize you've been walking through a life built on sand and the tide's finally coming in. I smiled. Not big. Not cruel. Just enough to let him know I'd heard the question and that he wasn't getting an answer. Because the truth was, by then, even I wasn't sure how much of it had been intentional and how much had just happened because no one ever stopped the fall. I'd set the first domino, sure. I'd drawn the map, planned the route, opened the doors, and waited for him to walk through. But somewhere along the way, the plan had stopped being about Rick and started being about me, about proving something, claiming something, taking back a sense of power I hadn't realized I'd missed until it was in my hands again. He didn't press the question. Just looked at me with eyes that seemed too old for his face, too worn for someone who used to think he'd live forever. He nodded once, like he understood something he hadn't quite put into words yet, then turned and walked back to his coffee, to his cigarette, to whatever version of life he'd managed to cling to after everything fell apart. I stood there for a long moment, watching him sit down again, watching the wind pick up a napkin off his table and send it spiraling across the sidewalk. I wondered if he'd ever figure it out, if he'd go back through the memories, trace the lines, and realize how carefully the house of cards had been built just to collapse at the right moment. Part of me hoped he would. Part of me hoped he never would. Because I wasn't proud of what I'd done. Not really. But I wasn't sorry either. Sometimes revenge doesn't look like fire. Sometimes it looks like paperwork. Like silence. Like years lived better than the man who swore you'd never amount to anything. It's slow. It's cold. And it lasts longer than rage ever could. I never told my mother what really happened. She still believed most of it had been bad luck, poor timing, Rick's own inability to get out of his own way. Maybe that was easier for her. Maybe it was easier for me too. Because admitting it would have meant acknowledging just how deep I'd gone, not just in tearing Rick down, but in becoming the kind of person who could. He still doesn't know what I took from him. And the truth is, maybe I took more than I ever meant to, or maybe I didn't take enough. Depends who you ask.